Hey friends, welcome to 2022 and a whole new year of working through and reflecting on our shared rule of life. It's good to be here with you. So here in the month of January of each year, we focus in on our shared commitment to simplicity. And this month, we're leaning into a focus on possessions. So first, let me just read a portion of our rule of life as it relates to possessions. The things that we have and keep often reflect cultural and personal values. They're rarely neutral and often have a formative effect on our lives. Our commitment to simplicity doesn't categorize possessions to be avoided and possessions to be embraced. Rather, we consider how our relationship to wealth and possessions help form us and impacts our relationship to God and to others. We invite members to look deeply at what forces are at work in our desire to acquire or hold on to any particular possession. Through regular examine and under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, with the help of a spiritual director, we notice any attachments to wealth and possessions in our life. In general, we encourage our members to find greater freedom in the possessions of fewer things, to hold loosely those things that we do possess, and to possess them with great intentionality and generosity. So let me start by saying that every time we circle around to one of our commitments, we have to keep in mind that we're sort of working in layers. We're slowly over time coming around each of these commitments and sort of turning over the soil a little bit, planting some seeds in that soil, doing a little bit of cultivation kind of work. And that's what we're doing every single month as we circle around our rule of life. We could also use a totally different analogy. If you've ever trained with weights or you've done some sort of exercise routine like CrossFit or calisthenics or something like that, you know that in order to strengthen any particular muscle of your body, you have to keep training that particular muscle. Like you have to increase the load on that particular body part to see that particular part of the body sort of stretch and grow. And this happens actually through, breaking down and building up. And so as we dive into this topic of wealth and possessions, like through a framework of simplicity, we're just returning to this topic to exercise this area of our life together as a community and to see where God may want to extend a deeper invitation to you in this particular area. So I think this issue of possessions and wealth and money, I think it's one of the most complex theological issues for us to sort through. Like particularly for those of us living in the West. The West is a really wealthy part of the world. And it's clear that the scriptures, Jesus has all of these sayings about money and possessions, and they're a bit more confrontational than about almost any other topic. Like there isn't always a sense of clarity about what it means for our actual life. And this is the task of discernment. This is the task of being in community, is sort of sorting some of that out and offering our lives and our thoughts to one another. This is the task of opening our lives up in prayer, asking God to speak specifically about this particular area of our life. So in this commitment to simplicity, as it relates to possessions and wealth, what we're trying to get at is this real tension that money and wealth and the acquisition of possessions puts on our soul. And so what I really want to remind us of is that in our rule of life is not a rule that dictates what you should or shouldn't own, or how much wealth you should store up or not store up. So at the center of our rule of life is the invitation to pursue simplicity of relationship to money and wealth and possessions. So very simply, are there complexities in your and my relationship to possessions and wealth that God would want to sort of shine a light on and ask us to explore? So at the heart of the monastic tradition, as a prophetic tradition, as far as I can see it, is a willingness to pursue a life that brings our inner world into the full gaze of God's light and into full awareness of our own self as it relates to all of these different commitments, so that we can partner with God as God seeks to heal us in all of these different ways. So sometimes that might actually include external choices that we might make with our possessions or our wealth, like almsgiving, for example, was one of the main practices of early monastic communities, like caring for the poor. So they would collect all this money and they would care for the poor. And they did this along with prayer and fasting and sort of some primary external activities because they recognized that acting in the real world with our possessions, with our riches, it actually did some internal work and it fulfilled the message of Christ. So what the monastic tradition tells us is of utmost importance is the inner lust and passion at work, the lust for more, or the fear that we have that what we have will be taken from us, or the envy that gets stirred up when we see the wealth of another person. So when we see in the monastic tradition is a commitment to voluntary poverty, for example, this voluntary poverty is less about the external renunciation of wealth. The external renunciation of wealth is not the thing that actually cures the disease of the soul. What it does is it prophetically throws you into conditions where all of the real poverty, the poverty of the soul, gets brought to the surface and you're sort of forced to deal with it. That's how the commitment to voluntary poverty works in the monastic tradition as I see it. There's no intrinsic value to voluntary poverty or involuntary poverty. And one of the mistakes that we often see within the monastic tradition, it does show up, is that there's this overemphasis on the external dispossession of wealth and possessions. But if we dig a little deeper, and if we sort of get under the hood a little bit of what is happening within the tradition, what we see is that the real work is the work that comes next. It's that internal work of prayer and fighting with the enemy who attacks us and stirs up our passions. This is how the early fathers talked about what was happening below the surface. So the enemy stirs up our passions with lies and provocation. And so the question that we have to ask in this work of recontextualizing and reimagining the monastic tradition is a question about what does it look like to have a vocation, to live a rule of life with others, and to have as part of our rule of life a commitment to simplicity in our relationship to wealth and possessions. And here we simply go back to the text of our rule. How does our relationship to wealth and possessions help form us and impact our relationship to God and others? We invite members to look deeply at what forces are at work in our desire to acquire or hold onto any particular possession. So what is at work internally when you think about your wealth or your possessions? The challenge is that getting a clear look at your relationship with wealth or possessions, that stuff that's going on the inside, it will probably require some type of disruption in your life. And again, this doesn't necessarily mean that you need to take some radical step in order to make that disruption happen, but it might mean that. It might mean you need to do some disrupting. And what being a part of the order of the common life means is that you are committed to asking these deeper questions in prayer and in community, and that you're committed to working this stuff through in spiritual direction, coming before God in prayer, bringing that stuff into spiritual direction. And ultimately, friends, the people that we are trying to become are people who live with a willingness to courageously respond to the invitations of the Spirit, whatever those things may be. So I actually know of someone whose disruption came not through giving away a bunch of money or through voluntary poverty, but actually their disruption came through a windfall. So this person was telling me that they were living relatively simply. They didn't have a lot of wealth stored up. There's not like a lot for them to point to in regards to sort of external financial security. And they had come to a place of contentment and peace. And then through an investment that they had made, all of a sudden, this person had a little bit of wealth stored up, a little bit more security. And what began to happen inside of them was they began to see how that this windfall was probably beginning to take up too much space. Like it became disruptive to their peace, and it did the work of revealing a previously hidden spot of wounding and sin and stuff that God was really asking this person to confront. So we can go all the way back to Clement of Alexandria, who is an early church father living actually prior to the emergence of monasticism. But Clement was sort of teaching some of this stuff a few generations before they took all of this into the desert. So he sort of informed the emergence of monasticism. And he was trying to sort out some of these questions about wealth and possession within a philosophical tradition that he was sort of caught up in prior to following Christ. But what he pointed out was that there is a way of being rich with possessions, and there is a way of being poor with possessions. There's a way of being rich with spirituality and a spiritual richness, and there's a way of being poor spiritually, and that we can have a number of different combinations of this. And so, friends, what I want us to do this month, what I'd love for us to lean into is to simply return to this question about simplicity in our relationship to possession and wealth and property. Like, where in your life is your relationship to these things, the pull that these things have on you, or the weight that these things bear within you, or the amount of space that these things are taking up in you? Where has it become complex? Where is it no longer simple, or has it ever been simple? And how does that complexity in your relationship to these things, how does that show up in your life? And does it show up in your thinking? Do you feel anxiety around wealth and possessions? Do you find yourself thinking about it a lot? Or do you find yourself working way too much to get that side hustle off the ground? Again, maybe this is actually what God is asking you to do. I don't know. I mean, maybe that's possible. But the other question is, have you overextended yourself because of a desire for more? Like, is this what God has asked you to do? Or is this something within you that has gotten sort of provoked in an unhealthy pattern? I don't know that for you, but what I believe is that as we bring these things before God with a simple prayer, and we ask God to show us where He'd like for us to sort of put our finger, I just believe that God will do work to bring us into some confrontation with disordered attachments and impure desires. And eventually all of this work impacts our relationships with one another. Not just in the order of the common life, but our relationships with others in community, and our relationship with the poor, and our engagement with those who have so much less than we have. So ultimately, friends, what all of this work is pointing to is that we are cultivating love of God and love of neighbor. And we're simply wondering how our complex relationship with wealth and possessions might be hindering that work. So let me just close here with a word from the Apostle Paul, who reminds us that we can actually throw off everything that hinders us in order to follow in the way of Jesus. So friends, we'll have a few questions for you to consider this month. Be sure to check those out. We'll have some things for you to think through as you head into your formation groups this month, where you can talk a little deeper about some of this stuff. Okay, friends, much love.